completes questions. We now come to the urgent question, but I'll let the front benches clear. Right, we come to the urgent question. Alicia Kearns.
Mr Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State to make a statement on the Telegraph Media Group proposed sale to RedBird IMI.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Rutland, for tabling this urgent question for a second time in as many days. And it's a very media-focused day for me today. I shall be taking the report stage of the media bill straight after this UQ, so forgive me if one has made me insufficiently prepared for the other and vice versa. Mr Speaker, I'm in the frustrating circumstance that I can say only what is publicly known and nothing of the specifics about questions over the ownership of the Telegraph Media Group, which contains within it two of the world's greatest newspapers, the Sunday and Daily Telegraph, and in the Spectator, the oldest surviving weekly magazine in the world. As honourable members will be aware, my right honourable friend, the Culture Secretary, has issued a public interest intervention notice in respect of the anticipated acquisition of the group by RB Investco Limited, further to that issued in November, into RedBird IMI Media Joint Venture, which remains in force. She is leading this process and examining it in great detail and with great care. But it is a quasi-judicial process involving the Competition and Markets Authority, who look at jurisdictional and competition matters, and Ofcom, who will be reporting to her on public interest considerations in relation to the media, expressly accurate presentation of the news and free expression of opinion. Both reports will be returning on the 11th of March. She is a KC, and as a very assiduous and diligent KC, she is making sure that I am absolutely excluded as Media Minister, because that is what the process demands, and I'm not permitted to know about the scrutiny underway or to interfere with it. She's also not permitted to take into account any political or presentational concerns in her deliberations, and we would not wish any chink of light on that to leave the process open to judicial review, which leaves me in the unenviable position of being faced with the understandable and expert probing by honourable members, to which I can offer no answer beyond what's in the public domain. But this is an urgent question, an opportunity for honourable members to make clear their concerns and views known, as much as it is for me to answer them. So I say, be heard loud and clear. Now, straight after this UQ, I shall be taking through the media bill, and I shall be making the case for this legislation in broad terms. I shall argue that a free media, not interfered with by government or indeed governments, able to articulate and reflect a broad range of views, free to speak, free to create, able to project to the world what democracy, a plurality of views and debate truly mean, is something important, something that we should value, something that underpins what we mean in many respects by a free society. And of course we all know that. It's something we repeat, automate and like, in a way that risks complacency. But as I watch the actions of authoritarian states during these times of turbulence, and as I see Western democracies in a knot of angst over our own values, and as I see our populations question if our values still matter from the safety of these shores, I'm reminded of the need to make the case again and again and again. So I cannot speak to this specific media ownership question, and I know that honourable members will understand that and help me keep within the tramlines that I have. But I can speak about media freedom, the need for media to be separate from political and government interference, the importance of a British voice domestically and internationally, the pride we can feel in media institutions like those in the Telegraph Media Group, some of which date back 2 centuries, and which drove changes in this nation as profound as the Great Reform Act, and whose writers to this day ask questions of all of us with a rare inquisitiveness and preoccupation with truth. And I can say, and I shall be finishing shortly, that I will be hearing the...
Sorry, order. Please don't tell me what you're going to do. I'm in charge of the time. You're way over. I expect you to now finish quickly.
And I can say, Mr Speaker, and I apologise for over-speaking, but I will be listening to the points made in the broadest of terms, and I suspect may agree with many of them.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for granting this important urgent question. The Minister does hit the nail on the head when she says this is about freedom from government interference, although it's quite something to start by knowing we will get no answer to any of our questions. We have a very proud tradition of a fiercely independent press in our country, and a press which holds us in this place to account, and a press which shines a light on misbehavings and misdoings both here and abroad. Yet we see a situation where a paper of record, the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator, the longest-running magazine in the world and my personal podcast of choice, will be purchased by a foreign state. The concern here is not foreign ownership, it is foreign state ownership. And in this situation, you cannot separate sheikh and state. And these are our concerns. I worry when we look more broadly, we have allowed our media, critical national infrastructure for our democracy, to fall between the cracks. We have the Defending Democracy Task Force, which only looks at electoral concerns. We have the National Security Investment Act, which has 17 sectors, but none of which are the media, and therefore we have no protections for this sort of situation. I have therefore 4 questions I'm hoping the Minister will at least attempt to answer, and I appreciate the restrictions in place. First, are there any examples around the world of a nation with differing media values, to be polite, acquiring the newspaper of another country? Secondly, will the government commit to a national security investigation into these purchases? 3, does the government not recognise its intervention in the UAE purchase of Vodafone sets a precedent that they can intervene here? And finally, will the government look to either extend the Defending Democracy Task Force or the 17 sectors under the NS&I sectors to make sure that we can protect our media, because this is something that will make us vulnerable, not for 5 years, not for 10 years, but for the rest of our lives, and we cannot afford our media to be undermined.
Here. Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions. Now, as she is aware, a public interest intervention notice has been issued in this case. That means that I'm not able to speak to a number of the points that will be likely raised, but it does also mean that there are powers under the Enterprise Act that allow us to look into acquisitions of this nature, that allow us to look at issues of media freedom and of expression, that allow us, we also have powers in relation to the National Security Act, which the Cabinet Office has a role in, and will allow the Secretary of State for Culture to look at some of the questions that she raises. There will now be an investigation by the Competition and Markets Authority, but also Ofcom, and that will look into all of these questions in great detail. That will allow the Secretary of State to make a judgment on which action she next takes, and potentially a longer investigation whereby she would be able to then be offered a particular remedies or be able to prevent a transaction. But I cannot speculate as to which actions she would likely take at this stage.
Secretary of State, Thangam Debbonaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm frankly frustrated with the Minister. I want to thank her for her answer, but it frankly wasn't an answer. The Honourable Member for Rutland, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, answered perfectly reasonable questions which did not go to the specifics, which zoomed out to the general, and we still had no answers. A strong and independent free press is a cornerstone of democracy. We have a long history of this in the UK. The Spectator is the oldest magazine in the world, and it is the responsibility of government, regardless of political persuasion or the newspaper under discussion, to safeguard that freedom, to scrutinise, to expose wrongdoing, and to speak truth to power. And we, on these benches, recognise the legitimate public interest concern raised over the proposed acquisition of the Telegraph Media Group, with accurate presentation of news, free expression of opinion in newspapers and the competition issues. I do welcome that the government has asked further questions, and I wait to read the conclusions of the investigations of the Competition and Markets Authority and Ofcom in full. But the Telegraph has been up for sale for months. The Secretary of State issued her first public interest intervention notice on the 30th of November. This process is ongoing, and employees at the Telegraph and the Spectator are left in limbo. Senior journalists have expressed significant concerns. So could the Minister tell the House why the Secretary of State has granted an extension to the deadline by which she expects to receive reports from Ofcom and the CMA in relation to the PIIN? I'm sure she can't, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. Could the Minister tell the House, this is a general one, so maybe, whether in light of the proposed sale, she has any plans to review the existing rules on media ownership? Has she or the Secretary of State discussed this, considered it, had any conversations with colleagues? Mr. Speaker, with a general election approaching and a significant year for democracy across the world, with record numbers of people going to the polls, the freedom of the press has never been more important. Now is not the time for the government to have no answers or be asleep at the wheel.
I thank her for her rather hyperbolic intervention. Now, we are having a debate because a public interest intervention notice has been issued. 2 notices have been issued. The government takes its powers in this respect extremely seriously. The Competition and Markets Authority and Ofcom will be given the space and time to look into all of these issues in detail, and those notices were issued because the Secretary of State takes these issues of media freedom extremely seriously and the ownership of important British media institutions. So I asked the lady to help us to have those investigations underway, that we do not prejudice those investigations, and that we make sure that those investigations are absolutely watertight, because these questions of media ownership are important ones that are cared about by all members of this House. And if I say anything in this chamber that should prejudice that process, then that will be something that would be regrettable. So I say to her again, action has been taken. It's something that the government takes extremely seriously, and I ask her to let the process take its course.
And Smith.
Mr. Speaker, it's hugely new for us to be told we're not going to get our questions answered at the dispatch box. We're used to that happening anyway, but it's always good to have us being told that it's a waste of our time being here in the first place, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, to press on with not being answered on this one, can I just say to my honourable friend that I and 28 others across party, in all parties, wrote a letter to her department specifying that we were all opposed to this potential takeover. We made it clear we weren't opposed because we dislike particularly the government, which I have to say may well be a feature, but the reality was we would oppose it would the French government wish to buy the newspapers, or even this government decide they would control it. We would oppose it on the basis it would trample right across the idea of freedom of the press. So I simply ask my honourable friend, following the notice that it's gone to the CMA, would she now speak to the Secretary of State and ask whether or not she would now create a new PIN on the basis that RedBird IRN has actually twice disrupted the government's efforts to properly scrutinise the approach, particularly with the idea of debt being loaded into this purchase. It needs to have a further detailed investigation, and I'd be grateful if she would do that, because this could easily turn into a disaster for this government.
Minister.
Well, I thank him. I should just say, I didn't say I would give no answers. I said I'd be able to give general answers, and he will understand why, because these are very precise processes that must be kept watertight. I would not want to do anything that prejudices those processes or the Secretary of State's ability to act in a way that is in this country's and in the media's interest on this. But again, I said it's not a waste of time. This is an important opportunity for this House to make its voice and its opinions known on what is a controversial issue, something that's of great public interest and something that we as a government are also very interested in. And he also raised an important point about he is not making a concern known about the government in this particular case. He is making a concern known about government ownership as a principle. It is something that I appreciate and understand, and it's something that I'm sure will be in the Secretary of State's mind.
Come to SNP spokesperson John Littleson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hosting COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber said there was no signs, I quote, behind the climate change emergency. The Sultan is head of the UAE Media Council and influential in the Telegraph takeover. Now, I worked for many years as a journalist. I understand democracy requires plurality in the media landscape. Sadly, in the UK, the vast majority of titles already skew to the right. In Scotland, for instance, as we know, half the population support independence, but only one title supports that position. So we don't want this situation worsening. I'm in favour of a free, diverse and vibrant press ecosystem. I'm not in favour of a newspaper being owned as a loss-making PR arm of a foreign state by access to our daily news cycle. So would she agree that allowing the UAE to take over the Telegraph would be unhealthy in principle for our democracy?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising an issue of principle, and it's one I perfectly well understand. It's something I speak about in relation to the BBC and how the BBC must have editorial independence from the government. And as a principle, I would be concerned about government ownership of any media institution, but I can speak, as he will fully be aware, only of principles.
Sir Julian Lewis.
When the wonderful Taylor Swift discovered that her back catalogue had been bought by a purchaser of whom she disapproved, she began to render it worthless by re-recording all her previous hits. Is this an example which the journalists on The Spectator and The Telegraph might do well to follow?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his mischievous suggestion, and it's one I couldn't possibly comment on, but I'm sure that it has been heard.
John MacDonald.
I'm still reeling from the comparison of Telegraph hacks with Taylor Swift, to be honest. If the Minister can't answer questions, maybe we could use this as an exercise in issuing some concerns that certainly from the NUJ's perspective is obviously about jobs, but it's also about editorial independence in the future. And so could I ask the Minister, that does behove the question, it does behove, I think, the Minister and the Government to look at the issues of what sanctions could be used in the future if agreements are reached and they're not held to, and the Murdoch is the best example of that. And in addition to that, whether or not there is time, as the Labour front bench has said, for a proper review of media ownership.
Yes,
Well, I thank him for speaking on behalf of the NUJ and for raising points about what this means for journalists, plurality of the media and the ability of journalists to hold us here to account. I agree with him in those generalities and I'm afraid I cannot say anything more about the specifics of this case, as he will be aware. But I'm sure that once this process is over, there will be questions to go back to about how we best look into aspects of how our media is owned.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For what it's worth, it's said that this proposal would enhance the competitive landscape and not diminish it. But does the Minister agree with me that these sort of decisions must be made on legal principles and not on politics? It's not appropriate to consider political posturing from the left or right in deciding this important matter, which is part of the Secretaries of State's quasi-judicial functions.
Minister.
Well, he is right to say that the Secretary of State will be under specific obligations to consider this matter without consideration of the politics of the question, and both the CMA and Ofcom will be looking at this from a very careful regulatory point of view. But I think we as politicians should also have a right to have some broad views in mind in relation to media ownership as we consider those questions. And the Secretary of State is the departmental owner of culture, media and sport, and will have already some considerations about how we make sure we have a dynamic media landscape. And I'm sure that she will apply her own careful legal brain to how she applies those principles.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the House sees me for what I am, which is a shy and retiring member. And for years, I've been teased in the Telegraph at the hands of Mr. Alan Cochrane, and more recently in the Spectator. But of course, that is democracy. That is the nature of the beast. That is free speech. And I agree with the honourable member. There is a national security implication here. And, Mr. Speaker, simply this. I think the mood of the House is that this is simply not on. We all agree on that, and I think that message should be passed back to the Secretary of State and to the Government. We won't wear this.
Minister.
I thank him, and I believe that when I last saw him, he was actually on his way to a Spectator Burns night party, if he doesn't mind me saying. So I do hope that relationships is warm and cordial now, and rather than any unkindness towards him from that magazine. But I think this is a useful exercise, as I said at the outset, in making the views of this House known in relation to this matter. It's an important opportunity for members to have their say, and I hope that they will be heard.
Sir David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say I was amused by the Secretary of State's, the Minister's opening remarks, because I cannot recall any judicial review ever being triggered by statements in Parliament, not once. However, given she wants a statement, not a question, can I say to her that in the event that this CMA/Ofcom report finds conditionally in favour in any way, she does not take as an example the Murdoch ownership of the Times, because since the sacking of the editor of the Times, that was a failure, not a success.
Minister.
Well, I thank him, but as he will be aware, the decision-making process is actually not mine. I will not be the person to make a judgment call on this. But the CMA and Ofcom will have until the 11th of March to do their initial report on this matter, and either at that stage undertakings can be accepted or a second stage can be opened up. And I'm sure that all of these questions will be in the Secretary of State's mind as she makes that judgment.
Jim Sharp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for her answers? They're always very helpful and we appreciate it. But can the Minister outline if measures can and will be put in place to secure editorial freedom in the long term, as we look to a nation with completely different ideals and who have capacity to shape media narrative and also public information. How can we make sure that we retain that trust?
Minister.
As he will be aware, a public notice has been issued on this, and Ofcom will be looking expressly at accurate presentation of the news and free expression of opinion when they are making their reports and judgments known. And I hope that will give him some assurance in relation to how the media considerations will be looked at in relation not just the competition aspects of this.
Sir John Whittingley.
Can I say to my honourable friend that I fully understand the limitations on what she can say, since, having been covering for her until a few weeks ago as Media Minister, I was given no inside information about this matter either. However, she will be aware that it is now over 5 years since the Ofcom report to the Secretary of State said that the internet has transformed the way news is provided and consumed, and that there will need to be a fundamental review of the media ownership regime. Does she agree with that, and can she say whether the government will undertake that review?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. He has been an expert cover for me, and it's a subject that we have discussed in our handover, and there was no information that he could share because he was very assiduous in his role, that he was not involved in areas that he should not be involved in. He asked a question about future ownership questions. He will be aware also that we are debating the media bill after this urgent question. We have looked at some questions in relation to media and the changing media landscape in particular, and the way in which the internet has changed the media landscape. That hasn't covered all of the issues that will be raised by a question like this acquisition, but I'm sure that once that process of the media bill is out of the way, we will then be able to look afresh at what the other holes in the landscape are.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that there is a limit to what the Minister can say about this potential sale of the Daily Telegraph to owners backed by the UAE. But are there any lessons for the freedom of the media that the government might have learned from the creation of university branch campuses in the UAE, and what that has meant for the freedom of speech?
Minister.
I thank him. I'm afraid this is not a subject of which I know a great deal, but I shall happily look into it and see whether there is any implications in relation to our own media landscape, but I can't comment it in relation to this specific acquisition.
Damon Collins.
Does the Minister agree with me that the fact we're in this position shows there does need to be some clarity over the media ownership rules and a presumption against sovereign foreign states acquiring assets of the UK media, strategic assets for their influence, as there would indeed there should be for an oligarch from a foreign country who may not have a commitment to the media acquiring them as well. And we need to provide some certainty as to how and where such an intervention could be made, and it's not just based purely on competition grounds.
Minister.
Thank you. This is a point being raised by a number of honourable members, and I should just say we do have tools in relation to these kinds of acquisitions, and we're seeing what that means in relation to the public interest intervention notices that we have imposed in this specific case. So I would just like to reassure members that it's not that we are totally naked in relation to this question. There are tools under the Enterprise Act that allow us to look into this, and I'm sure that once this process is over, we will then be able to look back and say whether any further action or intervention is required.
Sir John Redwood.
As owners expect to have influence over editors and the editorial line, why don't we have a policy of ruling out all government ownership of such organisations, which would just make it much simpler?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for making a very simple point, and it's one that I'm sure will be considered once this case is passed.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Were a media outlet in an authoritarian state, or indeed any other state, to be threatened with foreign ownership, would the Minister speaking on the issue be as scrupulous in her answers as she has so properly been with us today?
Perhaps not.
Minister. James Sunderland.
Deputy Speaker, I'm sure that many members like me are concerned about foreign ownership of our institutions and business. Our national resilience, strategic independence and critical infrastructure, as well as our media, are vital. So to quote the well-known song, how do we ensure that we do not end up selling England by the pound?
Minister.
Well, as I have said in previous answers to similar questions, we do actually have powers that can look into some of these investment and ownership questions. They don't just relate to media, but we have actually much broader national security investment powers now in relation to questions such as these, but also in other areas where we think that there is a critical national interest in the ownership of a particular asset. So it would be wrong for members to leave this chamber on the belief that there are no powers and that all of these acquisitions can go ahead regardless of some of the security and other implications that they might hold.
Andy Carter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister is absolutely right. Ofcom has a test that it can apply and does already apply to broadcast licences. Does she agree with me that that should be rolled over, given the changes in the media landscape, to news websites and news publishers that have significant scale?
Minister.
Well, we are looking at some of these questions in relation to how we regulate online content alongside how we regulate standard broadcast and other media output. And one of the outcomes, for instance, of the mid-term review is that some of the BBC's online material will be looked at in the same way that its other output is. So these are all questions that we as a department are looking into, making sure that the regulation and legislation that we have in relation to media is fit for what is a very rapidly changing media landscape.
Ian O'Brien.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clear that paying off the debt means that RedBird IMI have control over the titles. Indeed, they've already transferred the ownership of that debt to a new UK entity. Shouldn't the Secretary of State PIIN the debt as well to ensure that she retains control over the situation?
Minister.
Well, I thank him, and he will be aware this is the second of these notices that has been issued. I'm not able to speculate or speak on any other action that the Secretary of State might be minded to take. I know that he will understand that. He will also know that on the broad principles of which concern him and which he has written about so eloquently and powerfully in recent weeks and months are ones that are also close to my heart.
I thank the Minister for answering the urgent question.